So today I'm going to look at the poem Diving into the Wreck. If you want to look at the same version of the poem, it's an easy poem to find because it's so well known, by Adrienne Rich, written in the early 1970s. I'm looking at it on the website poets.org. I think I'll start by reading it just in case people don't know the poem, but you could fast forward if you know the poem, or if you just want to read it yourself, you could fast forward to when I begin discussing it. But I'm going to read it, and I always try to read a poem when I'm going to be discussing it right after. I don't necessarily quite read it in the way I might read it if I was like at a poetry reading. I read it in a way to kind of bring out, accentuate the meaning and to find the syntax in the poem, because sometimes, especially in a free verse poem like this, or really in any poem, it may not at first be apparent to some people kind of where the sentences, for lack of a better word, where the sentences are. So I'm going to try to read the poem in a way that kind of draws attention to that. So here we are, early 1970s poem by the American poet Adrienne Rich, Diving into the Wreck. First, having read the book of myths and loaded the camera and checked the edge of the knife blade, I put on the body armor of black rubber, the absurd flippers, the grave and awkward mask. I'm having to do this not like Cousteau with his assiduous team aboard the sun-flooded schooner, but here alone. There is a ladder. The ladder is always there, hanging innocently, close to the side of the schooner. We know what it is for, we who have used it. Otherwise, it's a piece of maritime floss, some sundry equipment. I go down, rung after rung, and still the oxygen immerses me, the blue light, the clear atoms of our human air. I go down. My flippers cripple me. I crawl like an insect down the ladder, and there is no one to tell me when the ocean will begin. First the air is blue, and then it is bluer, and then green, and then black. I am blacking out, and yet my mask is powerful. It pumps my blood with power. The sea is another story. The sea is not a question of power. I have to learn alone to turn my body without force in the deep element. And now it is easy to forget what I came for among so many who've always lived here, swaying their crenellated fans between the reefs. And besides, you breathe differently down here. I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes. The words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. I stroked the beam of my lamp slowly along the flank of something more permanent than fish or weed. The thing I came for, the wreck, and not the story of the wreck. The thing itself and not the myth. The drowned face always staring toward the sun, the evidence of damage worn by salt and sway into this threadbare beauty, the ribs of the disaster, curving their assertion among the tentative haunters. This is the place, and I am here. The mermaid whose dark hair streams black, the merman in his armored body. We circle silently about the wreck. We dive into the hold. I am she. I am he whose drowned face sleeps with open eyes, whose breasts still bear the stress, whose silver copper vermeil cargo lies obscurely inside barrels half-wedged and left to rot. We are the half-destroyed instruments that once held to a course, the water-eaten log, the fouled compass. We are, I am, you are, by cowardice or courage, the one who find our way back to this scene, carrying a knife, a camera, a book of myths in which our names do not appear. Okay, so a little bit of a story in this poem. Like there's like a lot of poems, but not all poems. There's a bit of a narrative, and I'll say one thing that I often ask when I'm talking to with students about poetry, a poem, looking closely at a poem, is what would be the movie version? My students get tired of hearing me ask that question. What would be the movie version of this poem? Just to help people realize that there are often in poems scenes, things happen. There's a final scene and that is often important in this poem. Maybe that final, this kind of penultimate scene, I think, is really important for when we get to it. The second, right near the end, at the end, kind of ending with this mysterious emphasis of this book, which actually is alluded to or mentioned in the explicitly in the very first line. First, having read the Book of Myths and loaded the camera, and we wonder, what is this Book of Myths? And then we see it again at the end of the poem, and we wonder about it even more. And by the time we get to the end of the poem, beginning of the poem, maybe we could ask ourselves this question, but by the time we get to the end of the poem, we might be ready to ask ourselves, like, if we went to the library and had to take out, quote unquote, the Book of Myths, what book might it be? But at the beginning here, we see some preparations, right? Some preparations for this adventure. Maybe even as we look at the way it's some of the details here, like this reference to, I put on the body armor, and we're kind of that's a metaphor, the body armor of black rubber, using, she's dressing up like a scuba diver, but making us think about nights, I think. And there's also a little bit of a potential weapon here with the knife. We have the camera, something to record the adventure. And then we have this other preparation of knowledge and learning, maybe the backstory before we go. So it sets up a quest. And I think we can say that, especially given that reference to armor. And then we think about like typical quests. Just it starts to kind of raise that image in our mind of a knight on a quest. And we think about what knights quest for, Holy Grail. We wonder, we think about what the Holy Grail really is. On the one hand, this cup, but can leads to a transformation, or a merging. I think it's hard to put into words exactly what happens when you find the Holy Grail, but I think it represents some kind of ascension, merging, or momentary attachment with the divine, right? It's and not only that it's not easy to find it, and you're going to go through challenges to get there, and you have to be worthy too. I think these challenges are tests that prove the quester's mettle. The other thing we think about, or the other thing might be to notice, is that those knights are almost always men. And yet, in this case, the narrator, the speaker here, says she is not like Cousteau. And if you happen not to know who Cousteau is, Cousteau's pretty interesting. If you are as old as I am and you were alive in the 70s, watching television in the 70s, maybe the 60s, you'll definitely know who Cousteau is, because he was one of the we all had many fewer channels back then, and so if something was on TV, as good chance that everybody saw it. And so Cousteau he's a diver, a marine explorer who really kind of pushed back the frontiers, because in the early 60s, the early 70s, the technology was just emerging for being able to do this underwater videography. And so he combined these, he and his assiduous team combined this skill set of filming and underwater exploration to be able to bring this to the world. So and now we're pretty used to seeing images from under the ocean, but Cousteau brought it to us, was one of the people who brought those images to us for the first time. And so it was almost as if he had, it would be like today, somebody going to Mars and walking around with a camera and maybe even going to different planets, because Cousteau went into different oceans and dove in different areas. Cousteau wore a red hat. He was the ship's captain. I don't know if officially that was his title that he gave himself, but he was the captain. Played this kind of manly role, and he narrated much of the show. It was kind of a documentary format, and you can actually see quite a few clips of the show. If this is all sounds new to you, you can go and watch clips on YouTube of Jacques Cousteau, and really interesting guy. I've just touched on the surface of his contributions. I think he actually helped invent something too, like some kind of the scuba gear. And so early 1970s, Adrienne Rich would have been aware of Cousteau, just like all the rest of it. And maybe he seen the incredible imagery from his dives, perhaps just gave her a little bit of material, something that her imagination and her preoccupations worked on to bring this poem to life. But even though she's diving, she's made it very clear that she's not like Cousteau. And maybe one of the many possible ways that she's not like Cousteau is that she is a woman. And there weren't very many women on, and I'm forgetting, I should know the name of his ship, but I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but it was famous. Everybody knew the name of his boat back when the fans of the show. There were very few women on the boat. I have seen a few clips on YouTube where women did visit, experts visited and helped with missions. But and Adrienne, and not only is she not like Cousteau, she's not like the typical knight. And Cousteau also had his team, and this speaker, and I'm blurring the lines here between poet and speaker, and I obviously want to be careful with that. We don't want to assume the poem is autobiographical. Sometimes students even ask, why are you saying she, when it comes to the diver? I don't know. It's a good question. I don't think there's really a definitive. It's open to discussion. What I usually say to when students ask that question is, if you don't have any evidence to the contrary, I don't think it's a huge mistake to assume that the speaker has a lot in common with the poet. And often there is a lot of evidence to the contrary, right? You give a dramatic monologue where entirely different, some historical person is the speaker and is definitely not the poet, or it's like there are characters in the poem. But just because we're suggesting that there's like or I am suggesting that we might see a little bit of Adrienne Rich in this speaker. Doesn't mean that we're pushing, that our goal is some kind of like autobiographical interpretation or of the poem. It's just, and I think it might also work with the end of the poem, but I think there are other parts of the poem that might suggest that this diver is a woman, at least at the beginning of the dive. Spoiler alert. So I suggested that there's a little bit of a invocation of the quest here. I think it's explicit and implicit, kind of pointing to the quest. And quests often have this kind of outer world and this inner world. We can talk about, like, we can use kind of Joseph Campbell language if we want to, but we don't have to. Going to the special world, and I think that's we can see that here too. That from the world of human air, we go into this very different element of the ocean, and it's a little bit of a challenge. It's a transition, and you have to go down this ladder, and it's really intriguing. This idea that we know what it is for, we who have used it. Otherwise, it's a piece of maritime floss, some random equipment. That's nice. That idea that there's this way to the underworld, and it's right there, but most of the time we don't even notice it. But there are certain people that do notice it, and I don't know. That makes me think of a lot of things, a lot of different stories. That you can think about the Matrix, and are you going to take the pill that takes you to this, wake up to the special real world, or are you just going to continue happily in the world that you're in? Or it also makes me think of listening to some real life explorers talk about sort of how they woke up to the idea that their front door of their homes is the beginning of an adventure. We are going under the water. I go down rung after rung, and still the oxygen immerses me. Thanks to the gear, the blue light, the scuba gear, the clear atoms of our human air. I go down. I crawl like an insect, right? This little bit of a metamorphosis here, turning into something different, losing maybe a kind of dexterity. And also it's just kind of vivid. Vivid helps us, when you have your flippers on, you're dressed in this black rubber suit. Don't we look a little bit like an insect? Again, this is at least the second time that we're made aware of the fact that the diver is alone. And that seems to be necessary for this, to separate this separation from something. Under the underwater, like this next kind of couple of stanzas here. First, the air is blue, all the way down to you breathe differently down here. Kind of a transitional part of the poem. And in some ways, maybe less important than the beginning in the end. I often feel like I have a little less to say about this part of the poem, but I think it's important because you can't go right from the beginning of the quest to the end of the quest, right? There has to be, there are some challenges, and this is going to be a relatively short, because there's a story here, right? It's going to be a relatively short retelling of a quest. And so instead of having all these incidents that you might have in a typical quest, I feel like it gets condensed into a couple of stanzas here, and points to what, for this version of a quest, are thematically what whatever exactly that means, probably a couple of things at the same time. That the sea is a special place. The sea is another story, right? And it's interesting, we've got books mentioned before. Now we have story mentioned here. Having nothing, that floating nothing to, like I have to learn alone. Interesting. To again alone, and to turn my body without force in this deep element. A couple other things there too. We have power. Here we have force. They're usually kind of similar on a metaphorical level or a connotative level. Might be pointing to something similar, but on a more literal level, just the idea of moving around underwater, what makes it tricky in this version of it is that, what's the word I'm looking for? You don't have a pivot. You don't have a ground or a wall or something that you can use to move yourself around. And so that is a challenge, right? And that, back to the metaphorical level, if you don't have a foundation, it's destabilizing, it's challenging, but maybe also liberating, right? Like maybe that, what if you are questioning that ground that usually makes things simple because it's right there, right? You can just push off that same ground all the time. And now you're going to float. And it's hard. You have to, but I think there's maybe this sense too that you learn, right? That you can get better at it. You can get used to it. You need to get used to it. So that's one of the things, floating in the first stanza. Second stanza, I think is an interesting idea too, in terms of like when you're taking all of the challenges that most questers face and deciding that, okay, I'm not writing 100-page long narrative here. This is going to be a condensed quest. So what's the big challenge, really? What really in our quests of life trip us? What really trips us up the most? And that might be, we could say, losing focus, right? Think about these things little goals we set for ourselves, and then somewhere along the way, we abandon the quest for whatever it was for, to learn a language, to get better at this or at that. And why did we abandon it? It wasn't a dragon. It wasn't an enemy. It was, we just got distracted. Other things took our attention. And especially when when you maybe got halfway there and you got just distracted by, like, let's say you're getting into, I mentioned cycling before. Let's say you want to get really fast, get really good, or take a certain long trip. But somewhere along the way, you get interested in, you just get caught up in how cool bikes are, and buying new parts for your bicycle, and just spend a lot of time, making your bike cooler and faster and lighter and that sort of thing. And so it's easy to forget what it came for among so many who've always lived here, swaying their crenellated fans between the reefs. And so I think she's just distracted by the novelty and beauty. Momentarily. And again, it's a different kind of breathing, different element. But regains focus. Okay. So it's not your typical kind of suspense and drama here, but it is there, right? And if we made kind of an animated version of this or something, this could be a little bit dramatic, where we see the diver get distracted halfway down to the wreck, but then shakes herself out of it and says, I came to explore the wreck. And then now we get into some really interesting, sort of thematically interesting statements here. The words are purposes. The words are maps. Poem about scuba diving, all this mention of books, story, words, maps. That's intriguing, right? That's maybe a little bit unexpected. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that still exist. I stroked the beam of my lamp slowly along the flank of something more permanent than fish or weed. So it seems she is arriving here. And the thought kind of continues here. She's found the thing I came for, the wreck, and not the story of the wreck. Maybe the most important line in the poem in terms of illuminating the kind of thematic core of the poem, that what she was looking for is the wreck and not the story of the wreck. And had to read the story, had to read the Book of Myths to inform herself enough to find it, understand it on some level perhaps, but wanted to get beyond the book to the real thing. The drowned face always staring. And so we're getting some personification of the wreck here toward the sun, the evidence of damage. And now we're good. Not only is it personified, but I think, and you might disagree with me, it's not, I can't make a really, really strong case for this, but I feel like the wreck is also personified in a little bit of a feminine way. Threadbare beauty, the ribs of the disaster curving their assertion among the tentative haunters, right? Those, on the literal level, probably those fish, underwater creatures the diver's encountering. This real sense of arrival now. And I think in this stanza, the stanza that begins, "This is the place," we're going to see a transformation. Right? It's as if she's touched the Holy Grail. And the music is starting, and the light is starting to emanate out of the Holy Grail, connecting the Grail to heaven or something like that. This is the kind of scene that we have here. This is the place. And I am here. And I am the mermaid. And I am the merman. Interesting. Coming back to that question of what gender this diver is. No longer I. Now we circle silently about the wreck. We dive into the hold. Back to first person. I am she. I am he. So it seems like this transformation has allowed the diver to transcend individuality, gender, in maybe merging with something larger than herself. Or, at least escaping the usual limitations of identity. And that works. Hard to find the right words for this. And it's, I think when we're paraphrasing poetry, we always kind of got to be aware that we're doing that very, like these haunters up here, tentative haunters. We have to kind of do that tentatively. And I don't say any of this really as a final and definitive, right? It's just engaging. I'm really just trying to engage with the poem. And I think sometimes when I'm talking about the poem, I might put these ideas in certain phrases, and other times I might stumble onto different phrases, and some are shed a certain light on the poem from a certain angle and reveal some aspects of the poem. Maybe if I choose slightly different words, not actually a different interpretation really, but just a slightly different angle of different words might reveal little textures from other textures in the poem. Continuing the syntax here, I'm she, I'm he, whose drowned face. So not only escaping the sense of usual limitations of identity, but seems to be merging with the wreck that she, he, we, are, was the wreck, the drowned face, who sleeps with open eyes, whose breasts still bear the stress, whose silver, copper, film, cargo lies. So this wreck, she has merged, they have merged with the wreck. And we get to see more about this wreck that it has cargo inside. left to rot, right? There's untapped or ruined potential there. And there's destruction, half destroyed. And what happened to this? Why is there a wreck? Big question. Maybe we should have even asked that sooner. We're talking about a wreck. Like where, what is it? Was it like the Titanic? Was it due to war? That once it followed a course, once it followed a route, was that the problem? Did it get off course? What log is obviously the book that the captain and navigator assistants kept, not a piece of wood log, the water-eaten book, and the compass that is currently fouled. I wonder if it was fouled before. Was that the problem? Is that what led to the ship, the boat, to have an accident and sink? And all of this is her, is they, is we. So if we're starting to think, or maybe we already are thinking metaphorically here, what is the wreck? The wreck of what, right? And then taking a breath for the final little stanza. We are, I am, you are. Okay, now like we've definitely been brought, now clearly asserting that she's thinking of this, or we should think of this wreck as something that includes us. By cowardice or courage, the one who find our way back to this scene. And once again, we have that list of things that we needed. The knife, self-defense, useful tool, recording with a camera, the book of myths that prepared us. And now we know something else about this book of myths in which our names do not appear. We go back up. It didn't tell us that at the beginning. First, having read the book of myths, we don't know the title, but we know that our names are not there. And so, back to our question, if you had to go to the library and take out the book of myths, some book in which our names don't appear, what book are you taking out? Sometimes in class, students will say, well, Greek myths, maybe. Like, they kind of they see the word myth, they think Greek myth, and they take out Greek myths. And, I think that's not a bad answer. Some students might say history, maybe a history book. And I think that's not a bad answer. Sometimes students will say the Bible, and I think that's not a bad answer too. I think it's the whole library in a way. It's the whole library before what year? I don't know. Before 1960, before 1900. And whose names don't appear and in those books. And I think that if we one of the things that all books have in common is that they form a kind of history of humanity, and obviously we're not in that history because we're not written, but maybe we will be in the next round of books that are written. So you could follow that line of reasoning. It's like we aren't in those books, so they're only so helpful for us. We read them, and then we have to go and see things for ourselves. And I think that doesn't work too bad in the poem. Is that what we're doing here with this dive? Is seeing things for ourselves, getting beyond what we've learned and maybe questioning as well, leaving it behind, becoming unstable in this floating element, and having to somehow come to things on our own terms. And then what is this wreck we're looking at? Is it just kind of humanity? Is it so that we can see how we got here? How did we really get here? Not just going to read about it, but we're going to go and look at it for ourselves. And I think that works pretty well. And I think that there's a lot of parts of the poem where you can say, yeah, that would fit into that theme. But there might be some parts of the poem that feel like this doesn't fit super well. Like, it seems like we're leaving this on the table, if we're trying to put together this reading. Like, what are we going to do with all of this? I am she, I am he. That idea, escape from a singularly gendered identity. And so what if the books that don't have names are those history books that talk about kings and generals and popes, but you don't have very many women's names in those books. And we can even think back to the 1970s and the same time the poem was written, and women historians saying, we have to kind of redo history. We have to write her story. That seems to work pretty well as too, that idea that what we're doing here is we're reading all the patriarchal history, learning one version of history or half of history, and then going back and or working from that to see things for ourselves, and which kind of parallels our other interpretation where we said it's just about getting to the truth. Because in this interpretation of the poem, again, it is just about getting to the fuller truth, and yet we've just kind of narrowed our interpretation a little bit. And I think probably it's a richer interpretation, because now this stanza, I am here, the mermaid and the merman, make a lot more sense. They suddenly make sense. We can do something with that. So I think that's a pretty good test of whether or not your interpretation is really a rich, valuable, accurate interpretation, is that you don't have to ignore large parts of the poem for it to work. And that's why I think that, this is probably the central theme interpretation of the poem is this feminist quest. Use the tools of the masculine world, of the patriarchal world. Take the male knight's armor. Use Cousteau's his scuba gear, but to go down and and leave all that behind. And now we understand, right, the stress on being alone, right? Because you got to get beyond that influence and dive into things yourself. The last thing I would say about the poem, just as kind of like a poem to learn from in terms of learning about literature and about poetry, is that it works like an allegory. Allegory usually means, and I use it this way, it's something that would apply to a whole work, right? Like, you don't usually point to a line and say, it's not like a metaphor. Right? A metaphor is a couple of lines, few words. Allegory is how for the most part, it's how a whole text is working. And I think of it as a kind of a lens, in a way. I've stumbled on, in terms of how I explain it. Like, it's you have a text, you have a poem, and then you have like this. And the way it works, it kind of sets up this kind of allegorical lens where, so every element in the poem diffracts and creates a new picture, right? So it's a special kind of lens. It doesn't just magnify something or contract something. It transforms it and then kind of projects onto the wall, onto the paper at the back of your head a kind of one, like close to a one-to-one reading from the original. And so on the one hand, it's a poem about going underwater, diving down in the water. And it's in kind of a vivid poem about that. If you just read this poem to you about scuba diving, I could be wrong. I'm going to guess though that Adrienne Rich never scuba dove. And I think that almost every reader is going to feel like there's something more to the poem than that, right? That it's not just about going underwater, going down and looking at other ships. And so on this other level, this other allegorical level, it is about studying, learning above the water, and then taking what you've learned and going and seeing things for yourself and being a bit of a documentarian about it as well, because you have your camera with you. And then you go down, questioning, looking at the world, at truth. And it's not purely academic, it's actually transformative, because by asking yourself questions and then going and looking for the truth, your identity is going to become kind of fluid. That works. And we don't know because this poem stops underwater. It's interesting to think about what happens next, right? Is this a transitional? Is this a moment, a temporary phase? Is it transitional? What comes out the other side? Who are you when you come back to the surface? Those are all questions that I think are fun to think about. And maybe just one last little idea I will throw out to leave you with is that maybe there's another level too. Maybe there's another level to this allegory that what we have just done, right? And why there is a you there at the end. Why she brings in that pronoun you. We are, I am, you are. That we by discussing the poem, by reading carefully beyond the surface, that we are all like this diver. By cowardice or courage, we also have gone back to the scene.